Keynote speaker today. Uh, Dr. Emily holds a special chair at the University of Amsterdam in Word and Image and is Associate Professor of Cultural Education at the University of Maastricht. She is a Cornelius Leadership Fellow and a PI on a research project entitled Senses-Based Learning. She is an advisory board member for the Koopman Collection and an ambassador for Illustration Embassy Amsterdam. She specializes in museum participatory practices and the impact of art on audiences, word and image interdisciplinary studies, especially French 19th century, early 20th century, and digital and sensory education. Emily's research spans the fields of history, literary studies, art history, museology, cultural education, and sociology. She focuses on issues of storytelling, identity, and multimodality in space, in text, and in images. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emily, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Isaac, for having me, and thank you, Manly, for organizing everything. So I'm really happy to be there. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk to you today about museum spaces as site of identity negotiation. So the reason why I wanted to kind of talk about this is because I think there's often a disconnect between the fields of museology and the field of art history, and especially when it comes to this idea of identity. And so I'm going to try today to investigate really the museum as a space of identity negotiation and question the different roles that the visual arts play within this negotiation process. So I will start today with a little bit of kind of exploration of different understandings of identity and of space. I will kind of ask myself a little bit, why the museums and why should we expect that from our museums and what can we expect from the museum? And then I will present something that's very much a work in progress, and I'm hoping to have a lot of discussions with you afterwards on that to try to kind of sort through different types of museum spaces as site of identity negotiation. So in function of the way in which the museum space kind of gains agency in that kind of process of identity negotiation. So let's get started. So the problem with identity in space, and with just the definition of identity, is that the idea of identity is constantly evolving through time. I think that that's one thing that we can see, and I think there's more and more of a disconnect between 20th, 19th, and 20th century understandings of identity and those that we see today that are very much based on performances of identity with Judith Butler, etc., and problems of intersectionality. So I'm going to go back a little bit here and kind of discuss the kind of predecessors of that with the social and personal identity that was kind of established by Vygotsky and that Morales and all the other authors have then developed. Because I think, but so briefly, social identity really came to be understood as the ways in which individuals identify with various social groups, whether they are large or small groups, such as, their family, as readers, as art lovers, or as, a certain nationality or a certain generation. Whereas personal identity was broadly understood as how we perceive or identify ourselves. So that's our individual qualities. That's, intelligence and shyness or assertiveness, etc. So those kind of social and personal identity were seen as both contributing to our individual identity formation. And so this kind of view of identity, this kind of dual view of identity was really dominant and is still dominant in most of the institutions, actually, cultural institutions. So that's also an interesting kind of thing for us to think about, these different speeds of understandings of identity. And it's something that's is still very prevalent. Another perspective on identity has been developed by Natalie Einisch about with identity as layers, identity as being a designation by others. So the way others might perceive you. So, for example, when I'm in the Netherlands, I'm very much perceived as a French person, which is really funny because when I'm in France, people don't really perceive me as a French person. But that designation by others is kind of part of my identity. Then there is the presentation, how you present yourself for others, how you kind of you self-identify, if you want, your identity. And then there is a self-perception, which has nothing to do with others, which is really by the self for the self. And like, so this kind of inward looking understanding of identity. So it's quite a different composition, if you want, than the social and the personal. There's here, the relationship is between you and the others. So I think that that's also something that can be an interesting kind of material to play with. What's interesting for us is also that gradually what we've seen with intersectionality and situated approaches to identity is really this acceptance that identity is cumulative, that there are contradictions in our identities, and that you're very good at negotiating those contradiction, at adjusting them, at presenting them, and that learning is actually very much a part of that process of identity formation. As we kind of explained, learning is the basis of identity formation, that is becoming a different person rather than primarily the acquisition of knowledge product. And of course, that's where the museum comes in. So we'll come back to this later, but I think it's important to kind of keep understanding this. I would like to take a little kind of sideway road with identity and space. So they're trying to connect how we understand this kind of tying between identity and space. And interestingly enough, it goes a lot through storytelling and through biography. So that's also something how that function in our understanding, because so for example, if we're looking at that connection between space and identity, we see that that there are going to be an anchorage of identity in space, whether it's an anchoring in terms of belonging or in terms of not belonging. And I think that that's also something that's interesting. So there's this kind of geographical thing. And then there is this persistence over time that also comes into play. So I think Gillis explains it quite nicely when he's saying that the core meaning of any individual or group identity is a sense of sameness over time and space, and is sustained by remembering. And what is remembered is defined by the assumed identity. And of course, when you're thinking of identity in that way, you're anchoring identity and identity negotiation in certain collective spaces. So that's where the museum comes in. And of course, this idea of negotiation process and of performance is going to come into play a lot in our kind of negotiation of that. So I'm not going to kind of go on for too long about these matters of definitions, but I think they're crucial for our understanding of what's happening in the museum and what art is doing to people in the museum in terms of that. But I think it's important to ask ourselves, why museums? Why are we asking museums to do this kind of identity work? I think it comes very much from a universal kind of conceptualization of museum, where museums for a really long time have been considered as sites where the I becomes a we. Except that in the last 50 years, what we have seen is that the I doesn't become a we, but rather there is this distinction between I and them that happens in the Universalist Museum. I think we've seen, as Clover is putting it really nicely, that public art galleries and museums do take sides. And indeed, Borg and Mayo have really explicitly kind of studied the museum as a site of struggle, of cultural contestation, and of renewal. It has become an identity battlefield, which I think is a really exciting role for a museum to play. So why museums? Well, because they have an impact on audiences, because they do something, because they're actually agents of change in society. And when I'm studying museum, I often use Tina Ropola's framework that comes from her 2012 book on designing exhibitions, because I think it's very precisely identifies processes of what museums do and what art does to people in those spaces. So the first kind of process that she identifies is that of framing. So it can be an institutional framing, it can be reframing a problem in a different context, it can be an exhibition framing. But this kind of work of creating that framework. The second process she identifies is that of resonating, where she's looking at how spaces and how artworks can amplify energy, can create perceptual resonance, how they can create an emotional context for audiences, create empathy, for example. We'll come back to that in a minute. The next process she identifies is that of channeling, which is really about giving direction, creating direction, and they can be narrative channels or they can be multimodal channels or spatial channels, but it's about creating those kind of paths for audiences. And the last process she identifies is broadening. So it can be broadening, it's about opening up to the world, right? So they are kind of, it can be affective, experiential, or discursive, but it's about opening up to the world. So what I'm going to do now is to look at, sorry, my lights are turning off. I have this weird light stuff where I have to get up for the lights to start again. There we go. So otherwise, otherwise they will turn off. It's to keep me active. It's always nice. But what I would like to do now with you is to look at those different kind of processes and to look at specific examples to try and define and try and see what kind of identity processes in action in those in different museum contexts. So the first kind of the beginning of my typology is a violent space. It's a space that very much essentializes identity, that otherize, if you want, the people that you see what I was telling you earlier about the I that becomes we. Here you really have an I that becomes them, right? There's really this this strong work, and it's a really interesting museum. This is a small museum that is a missionary museum. So it still exhibits its pieces exactly as they were exhibited when the missionaries were training to go out in the world and convert people to Catholicism. So it's a really interesting kind of museum that still stays in that context. And it's interesting because they are doing temporary exhibition and art interventions. And at the moment, they are having a temporary exhibition that's called The Collection Resists. And what they're doing here is transforming this violent space into a space of questioning identities. So here you have Diti Cagnari and Alberto Vanma, who are presenting their modern day cohort ancestor carving that's sheltering a modeled skull from Papua New Guinea, which is an object from the collection. And by doing this, they're really shifting this kind of problem of identity from a place of violence to a place of questioning, to a place of discussion, to a place of opening towards history, but also towards a contemporary understanding of issues in collections, of presenting identities in collections. So you have here a really good example of broadening of how art can be used to really open up issues of identities towards questioning, towards a plurality, towards an engagement that's not anymore an us and them engagement, but that really is about that's nourished by that's almost revealed. So the art is becoming a revelator of past violence, but also a revelator of contemporary questioning. So I think that that's kind of my first type, that kind of questioning space. The second type is, of course, based on Chantal Mouffe's work on agonist spaces. It's a space where various identities can coexist. And I find that an example of this that's really interesting is an exhibition that was a couple of years ago at the Amsterdam Museum, where they were exhibiting the Golden Couch coach. I never can pronounce it. Anyway, you see it in the middle. And this kind of, there are some really problematic painted panels on that coach. And the idea with that coach was really to, so the museum asked for to borrow it from the king. And the king said yes. And so they organized a whole exhibition with the couch in the middle and with multiple voices all around in all the buildings around that would kind of really trigger reflection. And that's what they paired up with local artists to engage really in a dialogue with the objects. And so really what you see here happening is the museum moving from a space of display to a space of dialogue. You see art being used as trigger for discussion, for reflection. And you have this kind of channeling of the different kind of interpretations that are possible for and relationships that are possible to that object, from an object that is, you know, part of the I, to an object that is part of the them, to an object that is part of the we. So really kind of allowing the object to become a meeting point, an objet commun, a common object on which we can reflect together, and validating all the different voices, all the different identification around that object. So that's my second type, the agonist space. The third type is one of discovery, where new identities are formed, where new voices are heard. And that's where I think the resonating kind of really comes into play. This idea that you're creating new stories, you're creating new identities, you're creating new spaces of empathy. I've put here a quote from Michel about how science changed the process of historical production, because I think it's an important thing for us to understand. So he really puts forward this idea that there are four crucial moments: the moment of fact creation, so the making of the sources; the moment of fact assembly, the making of the archives; the moment of fact retrieval, so that's the making of the narrative; and the moment of retrospective significance, which is the making of history in the final instance, or in that case of the exhibition. What's interesting that one of the main ways in which museums have actually engaged with this kind of process of creation of or exposure of new voices, or of exhibiting those other ways of understanding ourselves, is through participatory practices. And so what you have here are two examples from both from Marseille on different topics that have come to crystallize this idea of new identities being formed. So the first one is an exhibition you can see at the bottom on the social history of AIDS. The epidemic is not over. It was a co-created exhibition with about 40 participants, 40, so really quite something. And during that process, they really worked on on all the different levels that Trouillot puts forward. So there was a collection of objects and stories and artworks to really recreate or complete the sources that were existing in the museum. There was really the kind of a whole archival work that was done around this to really try to complete it. There was a making of narratives, there was a collection of narratives and a combination of various narratives in one spaces. And there was really this moment of the exhibition where it all came together in the final instance. So through the participatory process, all those different kind of layers came in. And what was interesting in terms of identity formation is that what you saw in that exhibition was that people came to really be able to identify with different players in that great drama of the kind of social history taking place there. You really had there was really a will to engage audiences in a very empathic way. So the aim was very much resonating with the audience to make people understand the stories, to make people understand the positions, different positions of different people, whether it's the medical workers or whether it's the parents of hemophiliac children, etc., so that there was really an engagement that became an empathic engagement in terms of that. And I think it also helped people look back and understand at that social history in different ways. And artworks there were used very much to contribute to that resonating process. They were very much integrated in the social history to support that resonating process. Keeping an eye on the time, I'll quickly tell you about the Musée d'Histoire de la Ville de Marseille, because it's a very nice story. And it's also participatory practice, but it's really a grassroots process there. Whereas in the other case, you had something that was more museum driven. Here you have a really interesting story in the sense that in Marseille, buildings fall down regularly. That's just what happens. Neglect. The way urban policies is built. It just really happens regularly. So, but in 2019, there was in the Rue d'Aubagne a disaster where a building fell down and actually killed some people. And as a consequence, the municipality decided to lock the buildings next door. It still is a popular kind of neighborhood, which means that it was very traumatic, I think, for people to have to be just locked out of their homes. Interestingly, though, the people from the neighborhood came together and decided to actually do something about this. And they decided that memory was a really important part of not forgetting that event. And to allow that event to become also part of their story and of the story of the city, and to actually be anchored there. And so they cut out one of the chains and they delivered it to the museum, to the history museum of the city of Marseille. And of course, this is the same city that is locking them out. So it's a really interesting kind of political moment. And the curator and the director of the museum and the curators, they actually took on the gift and collected stories and different voices of the people from the neighborhood to really use the museum as a place of resonance, as a place where other Marseille people could also come and share their story, could also come and identify with that problem, could really, let the community do its work really there. So really what you see here is the museum going from a neutral space to a space of affect and to kind of contribute to another role for art and another role for museums. So same thing, there was in that exhibition some art pieces that were all also kind of destined to enhance this kind of resonating process. My next type is then one of affirmation of identities. So it's really a lot about reframing. And my example here is from the Musam again. It's an exhibition that's called Barvalo, that was an exhibition co-created with Roma communities. And it was really interesting because the museum came to Roma communities saying, we want to do an exhibition about work and Roma communities. And Roma community representatives were like, well, this is great, but actually we want to talk about anti-Gypsyism because we think that's what's important. And so they worked together and kind of created that exhibition, which was very much focused on de-essentializing Roma identity and very much on trying to make people understand, so reframe the impact of anti-Gypsyism in general. And one of the pieces that I think was really good was a piece by Gabi Jimenez that you see here, which was called the Musée du Gadjo, which is so the museum of the non-Roma, if you want. And they very humorously recreated a mini museum in the museum. And it was really interesting the way they worked with, they first wanted to work with objects from the museum turned it down, and they had to gather objects, and so they wanted to show what essentialization looks like to them. And it was really interesting to see them then, kind of take Asterix as, the origins of the Gadjo and have, one living room clearly from the 70s recreated there, saying that, okay, that's the living room of all the Gadjos, and really trying to engage people, reframe the museum and play with the museum and with this idea of identity, of the non-Roma identity. To try and to put people in their position and to reframe that gaze towards the identity and toward that in that process of essentialization. So reframing was an important kind of part of that process. It was a very long process. It was a very, I think it took 4 years for the exhibition to come together and for the artworks to kind of come together. But I think it's really where you see art being used as a breaching experiment, as uh, and I think that that's also the power of artworks. And I think we've seen some of that today in the presentations, where you see art really creating that breach, creating that uncanny and really shifting our gaze, decentering really our gaze. So I think that that's something that's that we need to keep in mind in terms of the way in which museum functions. So the last one, I couldn't quite find a good label for it. I'm not that good at labels. So I had it as alternative use of space, and I'm going to try and formulate it as we're discussing it. And I'll be very happy to get feedback also if you think that as it's a unit or if you think it's still not the same things. Basically, the background for it was this idea of the museum as a space of care and as a space, as Noala Morse and Wayne Modest kind of put it, or the museum as a safe place for unsafe discussions. So I think it's about having hard discussions in a space that allows us to have those hard discussions. And I have two examples for you here, just to give you an idea of what I mean. The first one is at the Velde Museum in Amsterdam. It's an exhibition that's called Our Colonial Inheritance, and it's looking at colonialism and the history of colonialism and the way in which it shapes still our society, and it's in the way we behave with each other and the way we identify with each other and things like that. So I think it's and it's using there's a lot of artworks that are here to make you think, that are doing that breaching work, but I think are doing something else than the reframing. There's a healing process in there that's also happening. There's something that goes beyond, even beyond reparation. That's I'm not sure how to call it, a reconciliation if we want. I'm not sure where to go with it. And similarly, somehow I feel like there's something similar with this exhibition that has been I think very, very much talked about at the Quai Branly Jacques Chirac Mission Dakar Djibouti contre enquête, which was really looking at the ways, like how objects were acquired or stolen, and really trying to retrace the history of objects, where they're from, etc. During that terrible period. So I think that there's something here that's also interesting. That's a different type of relationship to space and to anchor that problems of identity, or kind of question that problem of identity into space. And that's still something that's that really needs thinking about. So I think I would like to open the floor for discussions, because I would like you to tell me if you think there are some other types, if you think that if the types make sense at all, actually. I think there is. I think museums as collective spaces become sites of negotiation, of mediation, of affirmation of identity. Yet they are very foreign spaces for a large part of the population. So I find that there's really interesting kind of frictions place here between what we wish our museums were, which are those spaces of negotiation, and what is actually happening. And I think art has a really role to play here in creating different different opportunities for for different mechanisms to be put in place to realize those different those shifts, if you want. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to kind of open the floor for discussions.
Well, thank you, Emily, for a wonderful lecture there, and so thought-provoking, really, about the different different roles that a museum can play in identity formation, and really it got me thinking about the different museums that I've visited recently, and the my interaction with them, and their interaction with broader broader society. Um, I thought it was fascinating how you discussed how one museum typology can shift into another. I think that's really interesting, particularly when we talk about freshening up museums, or kind of taking a historic collection and revitalizing it somehow, for perhaps to attract new communities to the museum. Um, yeah, so I thought that was interesting. One question I had is kind of who gets to decide what a museum should be? Is it the curator, and even when the curator works with a community, like you mentioned, a remote Romani community, who's in charge there? And maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I think the problems of negotiations of power are super interesting. I was
Mm,
discussing with the students this morning, and it got out of hand because then we went over time. But we were discussing this morning the problems of this idea of empowerment, right? That there is this idea that most cultural institutions now have in their kind of mission that they want to empower communities, blah, blah, blah. Except
mm,
that if you look at the definition of empowerment, that actually means that the institution needs to lose power to be able to give some, right? And
mm,
most institutions are actually not willing to give power. So there's this whole negotiation of that
mm,
needs to happen in terms of the goal of the museum, which is often set in documentation that's established by the board or the directors, etc. But that
mm,
then needs to be implemented by curators, by the education team, by all the different peoples
mm,
from different departments in the institution. But they need to agree. And
mm,
that was what was interesting with that exhibition with the Roma communities, is that there was a strong will from the curators, from the institution, and the co-curators from the Roma communities to work together. But what happened very quickly was that the co-curators from the Roma community said, well, that's all great, but we're actually not going to keep working with you guys if you don't remove all racist references to
mm,
Roma from your catalog that's online.
mm,
And so all of a sudden, they ended up to have to actually revise their catalog online. So there's this kind of and it was a very positive experience for the museum, I think, and it was high time that that happened, but it was unexpected. And I think that if you are going to engage in those processes of empowering communities and of responding, to society, you need to be ready for the institution to change. And I think a lot of
mm,
institutions are actually not ready for that to happen. So the
mm.
discourse is there, but I'm not sure that the actual uh, uh, will to deal with the consequences is.
Of that discourse, and how that will shape
Mm.
things. I mean, I had a question that kind of linked to that, about kind of, maybe I might describe them as like official interventions versus unofficial ones. We're thinking particularly about kind of activists, and the way that they've used museums as a stage to say something about the climate crisis, or those sorts of things. I mean, is that how does that fit into your typology?
Well, I've tried really hard to stay on identity, so that's but
Mm.
at the same time, I think it's a really interesting. I think for me, it goes into the agonist kind of typology of museum, because it's about adding more voices to the conversation, right? So I think that there is, and also using the museum as a forum, a place for dialogue, a place where, yeah, a place where we can where we can have those difficult conversations actually. So I think it's that's where I would see it. But I can tell you that a lot of museum management does not see it that way.
Mm. Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And we have a kind of a related question that from Galina, and she asked about the branding of museums. She says some museums today seem interested in changing how they present themselves. For instance, the Munch Museum in Oslo says we are not a museum, we are Munch as a way of to avoid us sounding traditional or old-fashioned. It seems that some institutions prefer to call themselves art spaces or cultural centers instead of museums. How do you see this trend? Is it mainly a branding choice, or does it reflect a real change of what museums are trying to be?
Well, I think it is both. I think there's partly a branding choice. It's a way to mark um, to mark yourself ideologically, as in transition. And it's often like this. You see that the words change uh, in order to reflect a reality that changes. So, for example, most education departments in museums are now called learning departments or
Mm,
audience outreach department because education doesn't sound right anymore. Like there's been this whole discussion about, yeah, the different powers, etc. So it's interesting that the word museum is starting to get that kind of old-fashioned, dusty kind of thing attached to it. So I think, yeah, I think Galina is right. I think that there is definitely a marketing exercise, but I think there is also what we see is an ideological shift. And I think there is also a shift in what we expect from our cultural institutions. We've come to expect them to actually be agents of change. We actually have come to expect them to actually engage with communities, which were not things that we expected from them 20 years ago. So I think it's
mm,
also a sign of, yeah, a gradual shift, but it takes time.
absolutely. And linked to that, I mean, the visitor numbers, for certainly for bigger museums, have grown, haven't they, over that time? It's become much more of a leisure activity to go to a museum.
Mhm.
Um, does that mean museums are becoming more central to our sense of ourselves and our communities?
Well,
Or
I think I think today it's it's quite, I was kind of saying the thing about the museum, the place where the I becomes a we or they, depending on how you're working. Sorry, I'm going into darkness here, so I have to move. They're really trying to keep me active. That's nice. So, but so what was I saying? Yes. So I think there's really a longing for discussing identity in a complex manner, in a way that's not essentializing, that's actually reflective and diverse. And I think that that museums are also responding to that demand. As I said, we've come to expect a lot more from our institution.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, link to that, we've got a question in the chat from Barbara Lee Estry. They ask about the labeling of exhibits in galleries, and there's
Mm.
been a lot of discussion of what they should and they shouldn't say. Um, and maybe perhaps you could comment on that.
That's a really good question. 100 years ago or something like that, when I lived in New Zealand for a while, and there was this gallery that had this great idea, I thought. Instead of having any labels at all, they had little chalkboard next to each of the artworks, so people could just write stuff,
Mm,
that they thought should be next to the artworks. And it's some of the most interesting labels I've ever read, actually probably much more interesting than any curatorial labels because
mm,
they were memories, they were little poems, they were, little drawings, they were actual responses to the work. And I thought there something interesting in terms of the the dynamic between the audience and the artworks that you don't necessarily have usually, well, you usually don't have with kind of traditional labeling. I do think they're an interesting tool, though, um, because I mean, they can be really directive. They just yeah, frame your experience. But they can also become places of questioning. They can become, places of reflection or places where you can send people back to themselves. So I think that also can be. But it can also be places where you stimulate people's imagination, whether sensory imagination or historical imagination or things like that. So, and I think that can also be a really interesting kind of use of labels. So I think they're a tool. So I never think that the tool is in itself doing anything. It doesn't have an intention. A label doesn't have an intention. It's the way in which we use those labels that create the intention. So yeah, sorry, I'm rambling now. I have to stop.
No, that's a fascinating reflection on it. I mean, and also given the this is our global New Voices conference. I mean, the different approaches to labeling in different countries and different museums is quite interesting. The more academic approaches versus ones where you say that where they're produced in conversation with their audiences. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no,
We
absolutely. And I mean, it can, no, go ahead.
no, I was handing over to you there. Oh, can you hear me okay? Oh, uh,
Yeah, I hear you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I just yeah, just yeah,
Sorry, there's another question in the chat box.
yeah. Oh yeah, let's move on to the next question. Sunjin asks, thanks you for an amazing talk, and I'd certainly agree with that. And she leaves a comment. I often think that the idea of a cultural institution, including a museum, is still based on the notion of cultivation or educating, which seems aligned with Enlightenment ideas. It makes me wonder, what exactly does cultivation mean? And who should we be cultivating, and who decides? Thank you for the presentation. It really made me reflect on these questions.
Thank you for your question. It's a really good question because that's the thing. Is it about cultivation or is it about growth? Because when you're cultivating, you're aiming for something, right? You're aiming for, tulips, for example, in the Netherlands. But when you're just focusing on growth, it doesn't matter what's growing. You're just growing, right? So it's really about each individual finding their growth. And I think the question of who decide what's cultivated and what's, where growth is. And I completely agree with you that cultural institutions are still very much, in that logic of the Enlightenment and of this kind of cultivation. But I think maybe they need to shift toward growth, toward that individual, a more individual framing. I'm not sure I'm being clear. If you have a garden and you're cultivating, you are actually targeting a specific goal. And I don't think that's the place of cultural institution to actually direct that specific goal. I don't think cultural institution should get to say whose culture is valuable and whose isn't. I think what they should do is allow for a variety of culture and a variety of definitions of culture, a variety of identities to develop through their means. So I think it's more about finding, creating space and finding mechanisms that will encourage growth no matter what it is that you're growing. Does that make sense? I'm big on letting my garden wildly grow. So I'm quite
But does that involve maybe changing you mentioned the people who work at the museums. Does that involve changing the kind of outlook of the people that work at the museum or even the people themselves and the
I think what it involves is a deep institutional change, because it's a new set of skills for museum workers. And I think that that's where the hard part is. I think today it's more beneficial for a curator to know how to work with participatory methods than it is to know art history from the 16th century, even though I do love art history from the 16th century, but one doesn't prevent the other. I think you can be both, right? And similarly, like, I think museum structures need to be looked at again. So why is it that we're separating, for example, the learning department from the curatorial department? What does it bring? What does it create in terms of synergies? Does it help that process, or does it hinder that process? So I think institutional change is a big part of looking again at what we do with those institutions. And I think because we've come to expect such different things from those institutions, we need to look at those structures again. We need to look at those people again. We need to look at who's working there, how, what kind of skills are there, to really be able to respond to those expectations that we have from our institutions.
And does that also include the spaces themselves? Because museums can be, they can be quite they can exclude people through just the fabric of the museum in London, where I am, or perhaps also where you are.
What do you mean? You don't like columns?
But I think we're just being aware of what these spaces, how they exclude people. It's also
and what they mean. I mean, having a building with columns is a building with columns. It means something. It creates a certain hierarchy and a certain power dynamic. So yeah, absolutely. I think that we should also be looking at our buildings, and we should be thinking really hard about how they impact on audiences, and who feels welcome and who doesn't feel welcome.
Man, do you have any questions?
Yes. Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. And I think your lecture evoked people to think about whose identity it is, and who has the power and who has more agency. And it's like a really complex discussion. And it also quite related to each other nowadays. And especially during this time of the period that it's really like a political period, and we know there are a lot of horrible things happen recently, including censorship in everywhere, every country, And I just think that you mentioned about museum as a space of care is really fascinating thought. I think the curator, their responsibility is also to care their collection. That's their probably principle as a curator. I also was wondering, do you have any suggestion for museum as an institution to do what, to have more unsafe discourse, to have more uncomfortable conversation? Do you have any suggestions about that?
I think it's a lot about having the courage to let people in, and to give people a stage and a place to discuss things that might not exist. Nanette Snoep, she's a curator in Cologne, in Köln. She's doing a lot of work with the communities in her museum, and she's managed to put into dialogue groups that would have never talked to each other before, groups of migrants with groups of extreme rights, politicized people. And really, I think that kind of mediation role, that kind of place where we can be together and actually disagree without, killing each other, that would be nice to kind of have those kind of spaces that are available. Also, because I think it's I mean, a museum is a space of empathy, right? It's a space where we go to look at art or to look at objects that tell us something about ourselves, of course, and about who we are, but also about the world. So if we see the museum as a space of empathy, if we see the museum as a space of care, then I think finding structures again, finding kind of models that allow us to create that dialogue between people that are very diverse, I think is a way to bridge what's depolarize also the positioning. So, and I think that that's an important role that museums should play today. So, yes, finding pockets of good practice and putting them all together and trying to find I mean, there's no recipe, but trying to find different strategies.
Yes, yeah. I think because like in terms of museum, when it relate to funding, like there are a lot of like complexity going on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I mean that's partly the problem in some countries where most of the funding is private, because if most of the funding is private, that means private interests are being served. I come from originally, I think you got it by now. I come from France originally, and our cultural institutions are very much public institutions, publicly funded. So that means that they have a duty to serve also the population, and that's all the population, not an elite. So I think there is an awareness of cultural institution as being social, as being deeply political, as being deeply anchored in political life. That's that disappears when you're having your cultural institutions that are financed by private interests.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Isaac, do you want to add something?
I think yeah, I think it's thank you so much for for a wonderful presentation, and I hope you found the question stimulating. I certainly did. It was it was a wonderful discussion there. And thanks so much for joining us, Emily, and being our keynote speaker for this year.
Thank you very much for having me.